Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Why am I hiding behind this piece of plywood? I'm hiding behind this piece of plywood because I have taken government advice and I am practicing for future terrorist attacks. They want us to run, hide and tell.
I've climbed to the summit of Everest.
I've tackled some big units. I've brought down the All Blacks.
I've trained in Taekwondo for 16 years.
I've been in the Paras, the Royal Marines and the Special Forces.
I've started from the bottom and fought my way to the top.
Do you know what I'd do in a knife or gun terror attack?
I'd run,
Hide.
Tell.
Right now, terrorism is a real threat.
and even though attacks are rare,
There are things you can do to stay safe.
Remember.
Run.
Hide.
Tell.
I feel so much better now after listening to that hand-picked group of fake role models. If you want to know what I mean by a fake role model, please follow this link. Bear Grylls, dear oh dear. I'd like to see him in a real Lord of the Flies type situation. He'd be in my cooking pot before you could say, pass the mustard. On with the show. I've had a huge number of emails about the Las Vegas shooting and have still not had a chance to read through them all. However, I would like to draw people's attention to this video made by Mike Adams entitled Forensic Acoustic Proof of Second Shooter in Las Vegas Massacre. This analysis claims to prove that there were at least 2 shooters firing bullets during the massacre. Although I have not analysed the audio myself, at first sight this looks like good evidence that there was at least 2 people firing bullets into the crowd, not one as reported in the news. The second shooter, it seems, was situated some distance from the first shooter who was firing from the Mandalay Hotel. If you want to watch the full video, you can find it online. So what's the significance of this? Well, the significance of this is huge. Firstly, assuming it is correct, it shows that the Las Vegas massacre was not carried out by a single lone nut or individual. It was carried out by a group. This group would have planned the event in order to make it look like it was carried out by a lone nut, thus escaping prosecution. To ensure that the lone nut was killed at the end of the attack would undoubtedly have been part of the plan of the group. This ensures that the patsy cannot give evidence against the group and ensures there is no legal trial against the dead perpetrator. Again, assuming the analysis is correct, it also shows that the group that planned and orchestrated this event are being protected by the FBI and being protected by the mainstream media in both the US and the UK. The shootings remind me of the Derek Bird Cumbria massacre, which I investigated in detail a few years ago, where I found strong evidence that at least one other gunman was responsible and that Derek Bird was a patsy in a much wider criminal conspiracy. I could mention many more lone gunman incidents where research has thrown up strong evidence that more than the official perpetrator was responsible. It's chilling to note just how easily the groups that perpetrate these attacks get away with their crimes. But hey, next time, just remember to hide behind your piece of plywood and then everything will be okay. Turning to another highly dubious terrorist attack, the Parsons Green bucket bomber. There are so many of these dubious events now, it is impossible for an individual like me to carry out detailed investigations on all of them. One piece of evidence which a viewer drew my attention to in relation to the bucket bomber was the police vehicles that attended the scene after the tube train was evacuated. Analysis of the number plates of the police cars, he alleges, reveals that all the police vehicles that attended had valid MOT certificates. I am informed that generally police vehicles are exempt from MOT testing and have a separate system for maintaining their cars and therefore usually are not registered for MOT. In order to verify the claims, I asked the viewer to obtain a random set of police vehicle registrations and check whether any of them were registered as having a valid MOT. He found that most of them did not have an MOT, but a small number did. So I am appealing for information on this issue. If there's anyone out there who knows exactly what the protocols are for police vehicles, please get in touch. So what's the significance of this? Well, it's being suggested or implied that the police vehicles that turned up at the Parsons Green incident were not real police vehicles. It's been suggested that they may have been props belonging to some outfit connected to the film industry, perhaps. Does this point to yet another fabricated terrorist attack or training exercise? Anyone with more information, please get in touch. And remember, don't forget to keep your piece of plywood handy just in case you need to hide. Okay? A few weeks ago I presented my research into the so-called Bridgend suicides. I say so-called because I do not believe many of them were suicides. This is an alleged suicide cluster of predominantly teenagers in or near the South Wales town of Bridgend. You can watch my lecture from this link. I have recently been told that on some occasions, after an attempted suicide, the victim will sometimes survive the attempt. And on these occasions, I have been told that it has been known for the victim to suffer short-term memory loss immediately before the attempted suicide. Could this be further evidence of stealth weapons testing as suggested in my lecture? Anyone with information on these characteristics, please get in touch. Now, viewers may remember Muad'Dib, or Anthony John Hill, who made a film about the 2005 London bombings, another fabricated terrorist attack called 7/7 Ripple Effect. That film was updated and is now called 7/7 Ripple Effect 2. You can watch it from this link. You may also recall that I reported on the disgraceful behaviour of the UK government to extradite him from Ireland and then incarcerate him for over 150 days in Wandsworth prison for no good reason other than trying to inform people about his film. Now, for many years, Muad'Dib has campaigned to try and shine a light onto the British monarchy because he states that Queen Elizabeth has no right to be on the throne. He can prove that she has broken her coronation oath, an oath which she signed in 1953. This is what part of the oath states. Will you, to the utmost of your power, maintain the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel? Will you, to the utmost of your power, maintain in the United Kingdom the Protestant Reformed religion established by law? Will you maintain and preserve inviolably the settlement of the Church of England and the doctrine, worship, discipline and government thereof, as by law established in England? And will you preserve unto the bishops and clergy of England and to the churches there committed to their charge all such rights and privileges as by law do or shall appertain to them or any of them? The Queen then replies, all this I promise to do. Note that the Queen has a copy of the Bible in her hand containing God's law when she agrees to this.
She goes now to the altar to confirm before God the promises which she has made. The things which I have here before promised, I will perform and keep. The Queen kisses the Bible and subscribes the oath.
The things which I have here before promised, I will perform and keep, so help me God.
Now in this agreement, she is agreeing to maintain the laws of God to the utmost of her power. The laws of God means the laws set out in the Bible that she swore the oath to maintain with her hand on and then kissed. The Queen then, once in power, allowed her government to bring in legislation. This legislation has been used to control, enslave and impoverish us all of which Muad'Dib argues goes completely against the laws of God, i.e. the Bible, which means she has broken this coronation oath. This oath is a promise to the people of the UK, to you, to not enslave and impoverish you. Therefore, if she has broken the oath, it means we, the people, have the right to replace her. Muad'Dib states that Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Battenberg-Windsor ought to not be on the throne for a second reason. Let me explain. When the Queen was sworn into office during the coronation ceremony, she was supposed to be sitting on a very special ancient stone, known as the Stone of Destiny, the British throne. This is what it states on Wikipedia about that stone. The Stone of Scone, also known as the Stone of Destiny, and often referred to in England as the Coronation Stone, is an oblong block of red sandstone that was used for centuries in the coronation of the monarchs of Scotland and later the monarchs of England and the Kingdom of Great Britain. Historically, the artefact was kept at the now ruined Scone Abbey in Scone near Perth. It is also known as Jacob's Pillow Stone and the Tanist Stone, and in Scottish Gaelic as Clachna Kinnaimhain. The Stone of Scone was last used in 1953 for the coronation of Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. As viewers may know, on Christmas Day 1950, this stone was removed from Westminster Abbey by 4 Scottish nationalists, and the stone went missing for just over 3 months. The nationalists gave the stone back by leaving it on the altar of Arbroath Abbey on the 11th of April 1951. The stone was then returned to the throne at Westminster Abbey. Well, that's the official story. Please note well, it is the Stone of Destiny that is the British throne, not the wooden chair. The problem is, as Muad'Dib has shown with photographic analysis and other evidence, that those Scottish nationalists made a replica stone and did not return the real stone. The real Stone of Destiny is still hidden somewhere in Scotland. So this means that when the Queen was sworn into power in 1953, she was knowingly sitting on a fake stone or on a fake throne. So what, you might say? Well, Muad'Dib states, albeit some might wrongly state it's only a technicality, that this is another reason why Elizabeth is not the rightful monarch in the eyes of God, whose throne it is. So why am I talking about this? Well, Muad'Dib is on a quest to find the real Stone of Destiny and has been posting Scotland messenger leaflets through people's doors all around Scotland with the intention of finding information that might help him locate the real Stone of Destiny in his quest to replace Queen Elizabeth and redistribute back to the British people all the wealth and land she and her forebears have stolen from the British people over many generations. You can read or download the Scotland Messenger leaflet from this link. So if you have any information of the whereabouts of the real Stone of Destiny, please get in touch with me or directly with Muad'Dib in confidence. On with the show. Today, a slight deviation from the usual subjects. I'm going to discuss hippies, drugs and murder. This week's guest has just finished his latest book, entitled Now is the Only Thing That's Real, a re-examination of the Manson murders, motives and mythos. What is myth and what is fact in the story of Charles Manson? What are the true motives behind the murders and who was really involved? There are many books covering this topic, yet very few have broken through the trials, prosecutors and the news media at the time. This book includes hundreds of hours of research into court and police documents, witness statements, media reports and interviews with those involved. How do Terry Melcher, Elvis Presley, the Beach Boys, Jane Fonda, the Mamas and the Papas, Michael Caine, Dean Martin, Angela Lansbury, Peter Sellers, Warren Beatty, Yul Brynner, Peter Falk, Cary Grant, Steve McQueen, Neil Young, Frank Zappa, Nancy Sinatra, Ronald Reagan and Debbie Harry fit into the tale? What Hollywood secrets did the industry, the police and the prosecution strive to keep hidden? Were the victims really chosen at random by a crazed cult of serial killers high on a mix of LSD, Satanism and the music of the Beatles? Read on to discover the secrets of the Manson family, their trial, the main players in the case and the murky world of Hollywood. And here's the author, Neil Sanders. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Right then, fascinating choice of subject matter. You've obviously spent a lot of time over the last, few years looking into this. Now, just one first thing to point out, this is some work. It's 560 pages and it's quite a small typeface as well, Neil.
Oh,
so
yes.
I don't know how many words is in this. It took
It's
me
about 220,000.
220,000 words. We actually had to postpone the interview because I hadn't finished reading the book. So there's a lot of detail in here. Now, before we talk about it, there's a few things I want you to point out to help understand the background to the time of Charles Manson, the late 60s. Just tell us what is Haight-Ashbury and, in general, the hippie movement of the 1960s, a little bit about that place and what was going on there.
Sure. Haight-Ashbury is a district in San Francisco where essentially quite a lot of people who would be termed hippies sort of collected and gathered. This became sort of a focal point for this new movement, which was essentially a sort of an anti-authoritarian based off the back of the anti-war movement, obviously because Vietnam was going off in the time, and sort of after the emergence of the teenager, basically people were sort of rejecting mainstream society, rejecting sort of the paths that have been gone down by their parents and looking at more sort of expansive sort of ideas about, inclusive society. This was, it's a very, very sort of like troubled time in as much as there was a lot of new civil rights movements, there was a lot of new student type movements, and a lot of people looking for equality from every aspect of society. And obviously there was a lot of people that were trying to sort of prevent that. The hippie movement sort of sprung out of a collection of sort of musicians, artists, and expressive thinkers that basically, as I say, rejected this and decided to come together in areas like the Haight-Ashbury. And there's a lot of festivals, things like Woodstock and Altamont later. There was the Be In Festival and various things like that. But it was an incredibly tumultuous time, to be quite honest. Like, I mean, for example, whilst people were, I think there was 30,000 people met at the Be In Festival in 1967. But at the same time, 30,000 young Americans were basically getting ready to launch an offensive in Vietnam in Operation Cedar Falls. So there was this incredible sort of dichotomy of love and hate, even though 1967 was actually called and is still termed as the summer of love because of all these emergent ideas and such like that. It's also called the long hot summer, because there was 159 race riots in America in that year alone. And these were serious race riots. We'd seen the murder of Malcolm X, the murder of Martin Luther King, the demonization of the Black Panther organization, the emergence of the SDS, and then later into the Weather Underground, who were essentially terrorist organizations, the Weather Underground. They decided to have a campaign of unannounced bombing and terror actions against the state, in order to, get their point across. Right.
Now, Haight-Ashbury was a place where a lot of very famous people lived, because we've got the Hollywood aspect to this as well. Just tell us a little bit about that.
About Haight or?
About who was living there in terms of
there was a lot of
famous
communes.
people.
I mean, one of the things was there was a group called the Diggers, who was essentially people who felt that you didn't need, they were like almost like freegans or sort of, sort of travellers, that type of thing. But obviously they just stayed in this area in San Francisco. San Francisco was obviously just a bit south from Hollywood or whatever. So basically it's a bit separate from Hollywood. So it was an area whereby people who weren't as wealthy as those in Hollywood, in Laurel Canyon or in Beverly Hills or whatever, who were also sort of experimenting with drugs, experimenting with free sex, experimenting with new ideas and new race relations and that type of thing. Haight-Ashbury was an area in San Francisco, and it attracted a lot of musicians, a lot of the sort of like what would become known as the hippie music of that time, utilised Haight-Ashbury as a place to sort of get noticed and stuff.
And
like
it was a bit like a magnet, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Attracting certain types of people who they want to get away from their parents, They want to risk having a completely fantastic new lifestyle.
Yeah.
It's going to be exciting. They're going to meet new people. They're going to have new ideas.
Absolutely.
That's where they all went to.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a sort of Carnaby Street, Camden type thing. It's a place where this is where it's at, this is where it's happening, and yeah, you kids, you can come along here. And certainly at the beginning, it was quite a. It was basically, there was a lot of helping one another. There was organisations like the Diggers that would make sure that everyone had food and that everybody had a place to stay and that people were safe. But it didn't take very long for biker gangs and drug dealers to come in. And like by the end of 1967, it was quite dangerous actually in the Haight, because there was a lot of Hells Angels, Straight Satans, people selling speeds, people selling heroin. A lot of heroin was coming back from Vietnam at that time as well.
Now, in the book, Neil, there's a report from some academic establishment which actually investigated this whole communal living and free love thing. And they state in this report that there were 200, or around about that number, different communities in the sort of Los Angeles area where, well, it actually explains that there are different types of communal living, where you might have one type where there's one male who's bonking all the females, or you might have it's a group of sort of little families in a commune, or indeed other possibilities, right? Some of which involves a lot of taking of drugs. So just tell us about that. I mean, do you think? Because if you go back in history, you'll find civilizations where they live in that way, where they would have a harem, for example. That's an example of that.
Or tribes, or that type of thing. Absolutely. Well, yeah, there was. I mean, again, it was more a sort of rejection of sort of normal or accepted societal values that allowed people. I mean, you know, there's still communes that exist. I mean, Dial House is still going off. You know, Penny Rimbaud of Crest still runs that, and. The idea was that basically, dependent on the type of commune, that we're accepting of you. You can be here and we can all be on an equal setting or whatever, dependent on the thing. Some of it, obviously, you know, I think quite a lot of wily characters just looked at this and went, yeah, I could get some girls off the back of this. And who can blame them?
Yeah, and maybe some drugs as well, perhaps.
Well, yeah.
So, all right then. But do you think that this possibly troubled central government?
Yeah, possibly.
They're thinking, oh my God, this is going to take over the United States.
Yeah,
do you think that's what their thinking was?
I think definitely, certainly after the Manson case, they utilised the concept of the Manson family to demonise that whole thing. I mean, there were other ones. There's like Hope Farm, which the Manson collective actually got kicked off of, and various other places like that where. So it wasn't uncommon. In fact, what's quite strange is I found about at least 3 or 4 communes, cults, whatever you want to call them, that actually attributed them. They called themselves the Family, which was the name that was erroneously given to Charles Manson, actually, like and his group. But yeah, I mean, there was even that one that Mendax, what's his name, blonde guy, hacker. He was
Assange.
Yeah,
allegedly.
He was in an Australian one called The Family, wasn't he?
Yeah, that was called The Family. That was that particular cult.
But there was a few. There's a film called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace by Adam Curtis, who did Power of Nightmares. And there's a section in there where he talks about a communal group.
Right.
But there were also sort of like, you know, it was only in the 50s that the groups like Scientology started to emerge, and they were not dissimilar in as much as, like, you know, they're a religious order whereby, you know, you go to them, you stay there, you give up your possessions, you become part of a broader collective. There was a lot of that, basically. So it was a time of change. I know that's a very glib thing, but basically a lot of people were looking for support, comfort and direction in that time.
Right. I think now a lot of people are moving. Well, when I say a lot of people, it's fashionable to want to live off-grid. In other words, they don't want any electricity. We don't want to be connected to any utilities. We want to be disconnected from the rat race. But not so much similar to how it was in the 60s, where it's more of a. It's not just a practical thing. It's the whole self, your soul, everything you're given to this group and entering into a group experience, isn't it? It's more of a.
It's a rejection of mainstream ideals and a sort
Yeah.
of like, look, that's not what life is about. Life is about experience
Yeah.
and interaction and life, not about 9 to 5s or whatever.
Yeah.
And these communes would, in theory, and still in theory, give you the opportunity to separate yourself from society, basically.
And governments will do anything to make them look daft or ridicule them or demonise them.
Yes, yeah, because, you know, they've got a lot invested in this civilization.
Yeah, they have. All right, now let's come on to the book, Neil. I just want to ask you, because your previous 2 books were quite broad in their subject matter, mind control in the media and direct forms of mind control. This is very specific because it's just focusing on the Manson case, albeit it's a lot of detail in there. Why this book, Neil? Why Charles Manson?
I've just always been fascinated with Charles Manson, to be quite honest. He's one of these people that has become he's an icon, and I don't mean that in a good sense. I mean that in the sort of signs and signifier. He's become a representation of evil. He's transcended the crimes that he committed. He's transcended the sort of position that he holds in society to become something far more. What's bizarre is that basically we'll go now W.H. Smith's and find a dozen serial killer books, A to Z of serial killers, and his face will be on the cover. It's widely known that basically Manson didn't actually kill anybody. He's not a serial killer. Some people will say, well, that's splitting hairs, he was behind it. Well, you know, we'll come on to that later. But the other thing is that basically when I started to write this book, I had an idea of what the answer would be, what was going to be behind the murders, what was going to be the sort of the driving factor in Manson, what the cover-up was about, etc., etc., etc. And bizarrely, the more I investigated it, the more I became convinced that was actually wrong. And the conclusion that I came up with in the end is very different to the one I actually began with.
Right. So it involves a cover-up, you think?
Yeah.
This
Definitely.
case. So all right. Now the book is split. The first third of the book, you've pretty much gone through the official story.
Yes.
And the trial.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of quotes from the trial and the different lawyers involved and the different characters involved.
Yeah.
The second 2/3 of the book, really, you're charting Manson's life. Well, right from his childhood through his prison years, and then when he gets out of prison in the mid-60s, and then he starts building this harem up, basically, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Well, so do you want to tell us what is the official story that a lot of people who have heard of Charles Manson will identify with and know that you pretty much knocked down in this book, I have to say. So what's the official story?
Well, firstly, the reason that I've said it out like that is so that basically anybody that doesn't have a clue who Charles Manson is could read this book and they could understand it. People that know the official story and accept that can read this book and they can understand it. People that basically have always thought that doesn't quite sit right with me, again, hopefully there'll be it'll be easy for them to understand. And what I sort of had to do was explain the official story before, so that to ensure that people knew it, before I could then say, now, forget all that. That's nonsense. And so it goes from the murders up until the end of the trial, and then it starts again when he's born and goes up to the trial again, basically. The official story is that Charles Manson was a lifetime criminal, came out of prison in 67, and basically went to the Haight-Ashbury and started hooking up with a group of girls and some lads as well, and slowly sort of built up this collective of followers, so to speak. They would drive around. Firstly, they were in a Volkswagen bus, and for whatever reason, he somehow seemed to sort of enamour himself with people at Universal Studios and be able to get in with certain celebrities at the time. And the official story is that essentially he wheedled his way into the sort of good graces of Terry Melcher, who was Doris Day's son and a record producer at the time. He produced The Byrds and some of the Beach Boys and such like that. And also Dennis Wilson, who was the drummer from the Beach Boys. He basically moved into Dennis's house and started apparently leeching him dry of all these things, on the understanding that him and perhaps Bobby Beausoleil, who was one of his followers, were to be given a record contract. Basically what happened was he was involved in the shooting of a drug dealer called Bernard Lotzer Papa Crow, And when this got back to the people, this sort of kiboshed any chance of a music thing. Now, Terry Melcher will actually tell you that basically they didn't pursue any music with Manson because he wasn't particularly good. That's not true at all, and there's a lot of evidence that proves that. Upon rejection from the music industry, he decided to enact this plan. He felt strongly that...
Just before I'll just expand a bit on that, Neil. But over the years prior to this, he's built up maybe 15, 16, 17 women who were all making love to him, and he's living in on it. Well, they lived in various places, but there was a particular ranch that they got control of.
Yeah.
And
Chatsworth,
they were predominantly females. That and the official story states that he was essentially mind controlling all of the people who were his followers.
Yeah. Basically, this is the point, that he led a cult, and through the use of LSD, communal sex, and stripping of identities, giving people new names and that type of thing, which, again, is not true. What he was able to do was basically make these people his acolytes, his complete acolytes that would follow him, and they actually believed him to be Jesus, or the reincarnation of Jesus. He himself apparently felt that he was Jesus and also the devil, and he had sort of elements of both of this, according to the official story. Now, using LSD and mystical religious iconography and a bit of prison patter and stuff like that, he convinced all his followers that there was going to be a race war, an apocalyptic race war that was going to come into fruition at any time soon, which he called apparently Helter Skelter. What the idea of Helter Skelter was that basically the disgruntled black population would rise up against the white oppressors and start murdering people at random. This would basically expand into a race war that would finish the entire planet. Manson and his canny followers would go off and hide in the desert. They were looking for this apparent place called the Bottomless Pit. The Bottomless Pit was a sort of Hopi Indian myth that it's kind of like the entrance to like Shangri-La or whatever. It's like an underground like cavern whereby you could live. And the idea was that Manson would live there for 144 till such time that his followers rose to 144,000, at which point they would re-emerge, go back into society, and sort of take hands on the tiller. They would sort of take over from the black man, who he felt would not have the experience to run society well, and so would really sort of be pleased when Manson came back and sort of take over the world. According to the official story, a lot of this was informed through the music of the Beatles, who he felt was actually giving him messages. Again, this is not true, but this is where he was getting this concept of Helter Skelter. Now,
so this is from the White Album?
This is from the White Album, absolutely. And basically, in order to sort of get some money for them going away to the desert, the official story is that they went over to a gentleman called Gary Hinman's house to try and steal $20,000 from him. This all went very badly, and he was killed. Following this, there was a raid on the ranch, and basically a couple of the people got arrested, and Sandra Good and Mary Bruner got arrested for credit card fraud. So in a rage, he decided to start Helter Skelter, and so the official story goes that basically he sent out various of his acolytes to the home where Terry Melcher used to live, which was 10050 Cielo Drive, which just so happened Terry Melcher didn't live there anymore. It was home to Roman Polanski and his wife Sharon Tate, and they had some friends staying there, which was Wojciech Wachowski, his girlfriend Abigail Folger, who was the heir to the Folger coffee empire, and Jay Sebring, who was a former boyfriend of Sharon, and also he was the hairdresser to the stars. He basically invented or popularised and made it okay for men to take care of their appearance. He introduced shampoo and scissors, and before that, basically men would have their hair cut with clippers.
Is this the birth of the metrosexual?
It may well be. It was actually a film involving Warren Beatty, who was involved in the story later on.
Right.
He was. It's called Shampoo. You may have seen it. That's the story of Jay Sebring. And if he hadn't have died, Sebring International would be the name that you knew instead of, say, Vidal Sassoon or something like that. But unfortunately, these were all murdered by Tex Watson, apparently at the behest of Charles Manson. The following night, Manson sent Tex out again to the home of, apparently at random, to the home of Rosemary and Lino LaBianca, who Tex murdered, and then they went back to the ranch. At this point, they were trying to move out to a ranch called the Myers and Barker Ranch, which is actually out in the desert, which was even further sort of removed from society.
So at these two murder scenes, with Tex Watson, who was with 3 women as well of Manson followers, and the story is that they were almost like just under complete mind control, following his orders. They've killed those 5, and then on another night they've killed another 2, which is part of this really potty, ridiculous plan, this helter-skelter thing. Who knows, Manson might have been brainwashed, but he'd brainwashed these other people, and basically he was ultimately responsible for all the murders. We're talking 7 people, 5 at the first one and 2 at the second. So that's really what the trials stated. And they actually gave one of the Manson followers exemption from prosecution in order to start. So just tell us about that.
Well, initially what happened was, the prosecution case was that these murders at the Tate and LaBianca homes were completely random, and they were just purely to initiate a response from the black population to cause helter-skelter. Now, immediately you might ask, well,
what we're saying here, just for people who aren't following this is the motive that was sold or put forward at the trial. That Manson was essentially mad, but he was very, very good at controlling people through hypnosis or mind control, and he'd orchestrated this completely crazy plot to start a race war. That's what they were saying at the trial.
Which apparently he would term helter-skelter. Now, you might question, why did they stop? You know, if you killed 2 people to actually initiate helter-skelter, why did they stop? Because helter-skelter didn't start. You could also make the question, why did they start helter-skelter before they found the bottomless pit, which was obviously the place where they were supposedly going to go and hide. Now, what happened was, because at the murder of Gary Hinman, Susan Atkins, who was, again...
so just to interrupt you there for people who aren't following, Neil, this is a murder which occurred before these 2 murders at these particular households, which circumstances from that may have led to these other murders.
They certainly did,
right. This is Gary Hinman, who was on the ranch, is that right?
No, Gary Hinman lived on his own, like away from the ranch. Well, basically what it was that Susan Atkins was actually present at the murder of Gary Hinman. Gary Hinman was a mescaline dealer and a friend of Manson, Bosley, Dennis Wilson, and various other people. For whatever reason, Bobby Bosley felt inclined to go over there and try and get some money off of him. Now, the prosecution said that Manson sent him over there to get $20,000 in order to help helter-skelter. And when Hinman refused, Bobby killed him. That's not the reason for the murder at all. The reason was actually to do with a gentleman called Danny DiCarlo, who was a straight Satan motorcyclist. But basically, there was a raid on the ranch because at the Manson group they were stripping down cars, they were stealing cars, they were turning them into dune buggies and then selling on the car parts at a huge profit, sometimes back to the very, very same dealerships that they actually stole them from. When a lot of them were arrested off the back of this, they found evidence that connected Susan Atkins to the murder of Gary Hinman. During the investigation, basically, somebody described Susan Atkins describing stabbing somebody, and they worked out from the details of the Gary Hinman case that this must have been a completely different murder. So what is this that Susan's actually confessing to? So when she's in jail, completely sort of apropos of nothing, really, Susan is approached by 2 very wealthy lawyers, one called Paul Caruso, one called Richard Calabrero, who it's never been explained who paid for these. These were really high-priced lawyers. These were like, a couple $100 an hour. And both of them usually had a reputation for dealing with sort of well-dressed Italian businessmen types, you know, the sort of people that might sit in restaurants or outside coffee shops all day discussing business, mafia types. But they approached Susan Atkins, who's this, you know, teenager who's in on double murder or whatever, and for completely no reason at all, he says, we'll take your case, completely pro bono. We don't require any money off you at all. All that they required of her was two things. One, that she write out a detailed confession of everything that happened, the motivation behind it, who Charles Manson was, helter-skelter, the reason that they killed the people at the Tate house. And their other caveat was that they owned the rights to this. So basically, before the trial had even started, shortly after Susan Atkins had made this fabulous confession about helter-skelter and the cult of Manson and various other celebrities, including Frank Sinatra and Tom Jones, that they'd planned to kill. This was released throughout the Los Angeles press. Basically, the lawyers had arranged for the entire story to be released in the Los Angeles Times in a serialized way, so that the entirety of the country knew the story before the trial had started. It was then passed on to a gentleman called Lawrence Schiller, who actually contained all this in a book called The Killing of Sharon Tate, which was again released before the trial started.
Yeah, so you think that the trial should have been a mistrial for multiple reasons?
There's about 6 reasons why it should have been a complete mistrial, basically. I mean, that, regardless of what you think, that makes the trial completely unfair. There's no way that anybody would not be prejudiced by this story that was in the media and in this book, basically. And it's incredibly strange practice that's never really happened before. I don't think it's really happened since, because, as I say, it would prejudice the case.
Right.
But this is exactly what did happen. What was very, very strange is very shortly before the trial was due to start, after this confession had come out from Susan Atkins, she actually turned around and denounced it. She basically said that she was put in a position whereby she was told, if you don't give us this story, you're going to the death penalty, and we're going to make sure that your child is sent to an orphanage, and a bad orphanage as well. We're going to, like, you know.
Now, it seemed there's one particular lawyer who really seemed to be orchestrating the whole case, the prosecution lawyer, who was essentially selling this story.
Vincent Bogliosi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and you think that the mafia is essentially behind him?
I think that there's enough things that he's mentioned in conversation to Charles Manson that indicates that. I mean, apparently Charles Manson was offered, right at the start of the trial, an 18-month sentence if he just turned over and admitted that Tex was behind the killings. And he turned this down because he's you know, his expression is he walks the line. He's not a snitch. He spent his entire time in prison.
Right. Well, let's come on to that then. Let's come on to that, Neil. So we'll just go from his troubled childhood up to him spending a lot of years in prison for very little, really, in his earlier years.
Yeah, he wasn't a lucky guy.
Yeah, and he met various very influential people in
prison. Yeah, throughout his time.
Who were in the mafia, basically. Just tell us about that. Tell us about the few people he met.
The first person of influence that he actually met was a gentleman called Frank Costello. Frank Costello is, he's sort of known by his other title, which is the Prime Minister of Crime. He was an incredibly influential mafia figure that rose to the very pinnacle of certain families. He's one of these people that was actually brought before Congress to sort of explain himself, and there's a very famous interchange where somebody says, "What have you ever done for this country?" And he responds, "I've paid my taxes," which is a nice off-the-cuff thing. But essentially, he had incredible sway in the prison. Whether this is strictly true or not is debated, but there is a story that Manson tells about, or somebody tells that they claim Manson has said, about Frank Costello reading his newspaper in prison and just refusing not to read his newspaper, even though the guards would say, you know, that's not on. He says, look, I read it at home, I'm going to read it here. And this is the influence that he had. Shortly after his introduction to Frank Costello, Manson, who at that point has got a fairly sort of scrappy prison record, you know, instances of sort of fighting, instances of homosexual rape, although for some reason they're not included in criminal record, and is considered a dangerous but quite intelligent psychopath. He knuckles down and all of a sudden learns about cars, he goes on a sort of engine management course and learns how to be a mechanic. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't tend to point is that he was a car thief before this, and he became an even better car thief just after that. So off the back of speaking to Frank Costello, he knuckles down, gets involved in this industry, this mechanics course, and then upon release, immediately starts stealing cars and running them down to places like Texas and stuff, where he also just so happens to start pimping out girls.
Right. I was just going to say, the other two industries that he was very proficient in was being a pimp,
yeah,
and also buying and selling drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the thing, like, you can't move cars from California down to Texas. You can't move girls across country without attracting at some point the interest of, you know, some sort of organised crime. In the mid-50s, he was actually, was a pimp in Hollywood at a place called 3 Star Enterprises, which by strange coincidence was next door to where Bernard Crowe, Lots of Papa, would later set up shop. And what he was doing there was it was a acting agency, but essentially an escort agency, and he was getting young girls in off the street, getting them to do pornographic photos and films, and then, if he could, setting them up with clients and then selling all the films. And this sort of collapsed when the father of one of these girls got wind of it and turned up at the office. Now, one of the strange things that's rather overlooked is that his partner in crime at the time was a chap called Tony Cassini. Tony Cassini was under investigation by the FBI because he was a member of the mafia. Following this, Manson, there's a bit more that went on, but essentially he went down to Texas and then went to Mexico to escape certain charges of pimping, essentially. Now, while he was in Mexico, he did a few things. He learnt to bullfight, he learnt to cliff dive, but he's also, in a lot of interviews, basically said that he was moving cocaine around, that he was moving cocaine for the mafia. Now, this would make sense because at that point, prior to this sort of the overthrow of Batista, like it was Cuba to Miami. That was where all the drugs were coming. That's where Lucky Luciano had set up his casino enterprises. And it was only when Batista fell that the mafia felt that it was more profitable and viable to move to Las Vegas with the help of Bugsy Siegel. Now, interestingly, it was actually Frank Sinatra that helped popularize Las Vegas as a holiday destination. You know, his star power was the pull that would allow Bugsy Siegel to sort of build this. And Sinatra was friends with Bugsy Siegel. Sinatra was also basically owned by Sam Giancana. He was friends with Lucky Luciano, and he was actually called to Cuba to sing at one of the mafia's big conferences, and he went there with the Fischetti brothers, who were again very, very sort of high-ranking mafia people. So yeah, but also whilst he's down there as well, Manson is given the hint that he's left a couple of bodies on the beach and carried a magnum around as well. So the indication is that he was involved in some sort of low-level crime at that point. I don't think he was in the mafia by any stretch of the imagination. Of course not. He was just, you know, if you are a drug dealer, pimp, mover of stolen vehicles and stuff like that, occasionally you're going to rub up against these people, and it's better to be in with them than not with them, basically.